I want to welcome everybody to May 2020, the New York Folklore Society's series highlighting 20 folk artists in 20 days of May. This series is sponsored by New York Folklore, a statewide service organization serving folk and traditional arts and culture in New York State, with grants from the New York State Council on the Arts provided through the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. Thank you all so much for joining, and it is my pleasure today to welcome Leah Koenig, who is an expert Jewish cook, despite her young years. I've known Leah, this is, and here I am, by the way, your host, Emily Socolov. I've known Leah for, I don't know, probably at least 10 years. When did you move to New York?
I moved to New York in 2004, so probably more like 15 years or close to 15 years. Yeah.
That's amazing. So, and your move to New York was a food-related move, was it not?
It was, yeah. So I moved here for a job, like a lot of 20-something New Yorkers. I graduated from college with degrees in environmental studies and religion, and ended up working for a nonprofit called Hazon, which some folks might be familiar with. It's a Jewish environmental nonprofit, and they do all sorts of work with sustainability and agriculture, and I ended up doing a lot of the agricultural work, which is sort of how I got into food. That was one of the big kind of points of entry for me.
That's great. So you have published amazing books, and we're going to look at their covers in a minute, but let's just talk a little bit about how you got into the world of food, in addition to the job you were doing.
Yeah, so I grew up with, in a kind of a like Midwestern Jewish household. My mom was a great cook. She didn't really allow me into the kitchen all that much. She was like always batting me away and, worried I was going to spill flour and everything, which was fair because I probably would have spilled some flour. So I didn't really get interested in cooking until college, and I lived in this great hippie co-op at Middlebury College where I went to school, and we cooked every weeknight for each other, and upwards of 20 or 30 people would just kind of join sometimes, so we had to make these massive meals on a nightly basis, and it was kind of trial by fire, right? Like I learned to cook for basically like cater before I learned how to cook for one or two people. So that was how I got into cooking. But in terms of writing about food, my work at Hazon, I started getting interviewed a lot because we were doing these programs, like Jewish community supported agriculture programs, where we would partner with farmers and with synagogues to kind of do education and vegetables. And it was just all very lovely and earnest and wonderful and perfect for me at the time. But I started to realize that I didn't really want to be the one getting asked the questions. I'm very Midwestern in that way. I don't like talking about myself. This is very, I've gotten better at it because it's part of my job now, but I realized I actually wanted to be writing about food and writing about interesting things that were happening in the food world. So I started very much as a generalist and would write about all sorts of food topics, and just was trying to find my way in that world. And then, the Jewish holidays started to roll around. It was Hanukkah, it was Passover, it was Rosh Hashanah, and all of these traditional foods that I had grown up eating that my mom cooked, I wanted to know how to make. But I was far away from her. She was in Chicago and I was in New York. So, I had to kind of learn on my own. Obviously I called her a lot, but, and it really felt like I was crafting both a repertoire of dishes, but also sort of crafting an identity, a Jewish identity. And, we talk a lot about how recipes and food sort of go hand in hand, and the stories we tell about ourselves are so bound up in the foods that we make. So I was kind of living that. And it kind of just went from there. I got really interested in the foods of my youth, and I started writing about them and then realized that Jewish cuisine is so much broader than just the Eastern European dishes that I grew up with. So it kind of flowed from there.
Right. So how did you come to write your first cookbook? And I'm going to screen share here so everybody can look at this. Well, actually, we're showing, I think, your second cookbook first.
Yeah.
But so how did that come to pass? Or maybe we can go back and then we can start with your first book. Here we go.
Sure. So Modern Jewish Cooking is actually my second book. I wrote a book with the organization Hadassah before this book, and I loved writing that book as well. But this was sort of my first book where it was my idea and my my joy coming out onto the page. So this book came out in 2015 with Chronicle, and it was really a culmination of what I was just sort of talking about in terms of finding a kind of contemporary identity within Jewish cuisine, right? Like Jewish food in America tends to be thought of as Eastern European, beige, brown, heavy, not that exciting, kind of, just kind of like lumpy and hard as hockey pucks. And if anything, it's been a butt of a joke more than it's been something that's been celebrated. And that was starting to change, and I was seeing it with my friends. We would get together and we would make latkes and we would make hamantashen and all these things, and there was such joy and vibrancy to it. And my hope was to capture that sense of joy and vibrancy within Jewish cooking in this book. So I do a lot in that book where I take traditional recipes and I sort of turn them on their heads a little bit and add unexpected flavors. The cover, for example, you see the latkes on the top left, the potato latkes, and underneath it is an apple date chutney. And normally you would serve latkes with sour cream and applesauce. My mom's applesauce happens to be like my favorite applesauce in the whole world. But for this book, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I called upon, the flavors of South Asia and kind of took like an apple onion vinegary, sweet, savory, tart chutney, and it's really, really, really great on latkes, and it kind of enlivens the dish in a way that you wouldn't expect otherwise. So that was my hope with Modern Jewish Cooking, and I still cook from that book, and I love it so much. And then the Jewish cookbook. This is my most recent cookbook. It's actually my sixth book. I've written 3 other little ones with Chronicle called The Little Book of Jewish Appetizers, The Little Book of Jewish Feasts, and The Little Book of Jewish Sweets, which is kind of a like choose your own adventure a la carte. They're very tiny. They're like petite little cutie books. They're good for gifts. But this is the exact opposite. I actually have the hard copy. Hold on, I want to make sure this is getting in the screen. So this is the Jewish cookbook. It's 425 recipes, and it came out this past fall with Biden as part of their Culinary Bible series. So they have, in the last maybe like half a decade, started this series of, China, the cookbook, Mexico, the cookbook, Cuba, the cookbook, where they really, the authors try to encapsulate the entire cuisine of a country within the pages of a book. They're meant to be sort of encyclopedic in a way, but also approachable and accessible, and books you want to cook from. So this book, which they asked me to write, I guess it was like almost 4 years ago now, because it took a while to create, was a little bit different because Jewish cuisine is not not geographically bound the same way Chinese cuisine is or Mexican cuisine is. Even though there's a million regions within Mexico or China, you kind of know what the boundaries are. But Jewish cooking is very much a global cuisine, right? Jews have lived and cooked everywhere besides maybe Antarctica. So you have dishes from Ethiopia, dishes from Mexico, dishes from Morocco, from, obviously Russia, Lithuania, America, Canada, everywhere, India, where there have been sizable Jewish communities. So the point of this book is to really, whether or not somebody has a Jewish background, if they do, they hopefully find their family in this book. And if they don't, it sort of serves as like a primer to what global Jewish cuisine really is. Because I think people don't really think even now so much about Jewish food as being more than just Ashkenazi Eastern European food, and then maybe Middle Eastern / Israeli food. So that's kind of what people think of, and this book hopefully expands that definition to think of Jewish food as a global cuisine.
Well, that's wonderful. So you've talked to me before about your work as a recipe developer and your work as a storyteller and how those interact. Because one of the things that's amazing about this book, aside from its scope, is the relationships that you relate to us as readers, in terms of collecting the recipes, in terms of sharing the recipes. So it is a whole socially grounded process for you. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, so I have a friend, Mitchell Davis, who has said something to me that stuck, which is that food without stories is just calories. And I love that saying because, I love a great tasting meal. I delight in, the physical, the taste and the sensorial, whatever, pleasure you get from a meal. But for me, what's most important is that the food connect you to something. It either connects you to a person, the person you learned it from, or the person whose book you're reading learned it from, or it connects you to a moment in time, or some kind of historical or cultural snapshot. And that's so specifically true with Jewish cuisine because, as I mentioned, Jews have lived and cooked everywhere, and they've traveled and communities have shifted and uprooted, and sometimes by force, often by force, sometimes by choice. And when they bring those foods with them and they bring them to a entirely new place, the foods begin to evolve, right? So evolution is very much at the heart of Jewish cuisine. And so trying to capture that, those threads of evolution to me is really, really important. I'll give one great example. Right now in Mexico City, there's a large Jewish communities, tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews. So there's Jews from all different backgrounds living in Mexico, but in the kind of early mid 20th century, there was a wave of people who moved. I'm sure, Emily, you know all about this, of Ashkenazi Jews who moved to Mexico. So it's a fairly new community in terms of history. And so it's only this generation, second or third generation now, that's starting to really play with recipes. So up until now, you would go to a Mexican Jewish house in Mexico City, and you would have a very traditional babka, a very traditional, chicken soup or whatever. And now you're starting to see people play. And one of my favorite dishes is chicken soup. So their chicken soup is a very, very basic Eastern European chicken soup, chicken, carrots, onions, parsley or whatever, but it sometimes gets a chipotle pepper thrown in there. And it's topped in the way that many Mexican soups are, with diced avocado and white onion and cilantro. So what you see is an old recipe finding its new home and incorporating some of the indigenous ingredients from that home. And to me, that is not just delicious, which it is, but it's also so fascinating. And it's it's a story worth telling because it tells you about more than just the food. So that's the kind of thing that I try to capture.
Absolutely. I mean, it's diaspora, and it's agglutinative, it sort of adds rather than subtracts. It takes what's in the environment. I have collected a bit in Jewish cookbooks, and I found there's this whole trend, which was always so disturbing to me, of taking a cuisine and just making it kosher and having that be the Jewish spin. In other words, if we divide the meat and the milk, and we could get into the sort of laws of kashrut, but I'm assuming people have a sense of that, that it's not just simply a simple act of translation. It really is an act of interpretation, and that's very much what you're saying. So let's talk a little bit about your own ethnography as a Jewish food person. I'm going to share screen again here and move over, and hopefully this will work. Here we go. Is that, you see that slide?
Yes,
Excellent.
I do. So when I am researching for a book or an article or whatever, let me back up. Often when I do cooking demonstrations, which up until very recently, I did a lot of in-person cooking demonstrations and now have started to do some online. But so often what I would do would, I would like give my talk and people would Q&A, and then I would be signing books after, and someone would come up to me and say like, oh, my grandmother made the best, dumpling of this kind, or the best, potato kugel, and here's what she did, and it was a little bit different, and she came from this part of Lithuania, and it was so. I would always listen to those stories, and in some ways it was just people needing to share and make connections, so that was worthwhile on its own. But I would also get ideas and say, oh, let me follow that thread, and let me try to figure out more about that. So for me, as a researcher and as an I don't know if I call myself an ethnographer. I'm more of a journalist. I'm not like a scholar in any traditional or trained way, but for me, that was always kind of an exciting place. And when people would tell me stuff, I'd be like, yes, tell me more. But whenever I am, doing a cooking demonstration somewhere away from New York City, I always try to find somebody or a group of people in whatever community I'm in to cook with. Because as you travel around, you get, Brooklyn has a ton of different types of Jewish communities, from Syrian to Russian to Ethiopian to, Indian to whatever. But, for example, in this picture, I was doing a cooking demonstration in Seattle, and I know from past research that there's this amazing cluster of Sephardic congregations. It's two congregations. One, I think, is Greek Jewish, and one is Turkish Jewish. And they both have baking groups that meet. They're not meeting now, I'm sure, but under non-coronavirus times, they meet, I believe, once a week. One may meet less frequently than that, but pretty regularly, to basically, as you can see in the picture, they sit together, they talk, kibitz, as you say in Yiddish, chit chat, and they bake together. And they're baking traditional Sephardic pastries. So they're making barekas, which people probably know is like the puff pastry filled with cheese or spinach, or a variety of other things. They make bulemas, which are a similar pastry, but they're coiled like a snail. And here they're making bizcochos, which I believe is a pretty catch-all term, but in Sephardic cuisine specifically means these kind of round, notched, they almost look like flowers, not very sweet, but they're more like a biscuit cookie. And they'll make them, and then they sell them at a bazaar that they have once a year. So they bake, they freeze, and then they sell to the community as a way of making funds to sustain the community. But they also just chat with each other, right? And it's just such a community thickening experience. And so when I was there, I cooked with a couple of the women there. I wasn't able to, timing wise, join one of their actual events, but I cooked in the home of one of the women. And so for me, that was like an amazing opportunity to get an insight, not just into a new food that I wanted to share, but also some food ways. And then we can go to the next one. So this is, I'm sorry, someone is, of course, leaf blowing outside the window. I hope that's not too apparent. This is Biji Barhani. She is an Ethiopian Israeli Jew. So she was born in Ethiopia, but around the age of 4, she immigrated to Israel with her family, and with most Ethiopian Jews moved to Israel in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. And so she, grew up in Israel and moved to New York in her 20s, I think, like after she had done university. And she was running this great organization for Ethiopian Jews in North America. And then she had decided she wanted to open up a restaurant, which is still around in Harlem. It's an amazing restaurant called the Scion Cafe that serves part Ethiopian dishes and part sort of Middle Eastern Israeli dishes. It's so delicious. If you live in Harlem and you're watching this, they're doing takeout right now during the coronavirus, so order from them. But with her, you know, I went over to her apartment in Harlem. This was several years ago now. And she was making these dishes that I had never eaten before. But for her family were, you know, Shabbat dinner. They were Friday night dinner dishes. And, you know, I was in her kitchen and like the foods themselves were totally foreign to me. Like it was, you know, there was ginger and there was chicken and eggs and turmeric and like all these like bearberry, like the Ethiopian chili spice. And so it was totally unusual for my palate, but the context was so familiar. Like she had her little kids running around and it just smelled like, you know, cooking for the holiday. And for me, it was a very crystallizing moment of how diverse and different Jewish cuisine can be depending on where you're from, but how there's a through line. And the through line is what you're doing the cooking for, right? You're doing it for the holiday, you're doing it for Shabbat, you're doing it for family. So that for me was another moment of, I walked away with recipes, but I also walked away with a sort of deeper connection of the importance of food in Jewish community. And then this wonderful person, Siona Benjamin, she lives in New Jersey, and I got in touch with her when I was working on a story about Indian Jewish cuisine. So India, like Ethiopia, has a historic Jewish community that now mostly has immigrated to Israel. But Siona grew up in Mumbai. And so I went to her house in New Jersey. She's an amazing artist. This is some of her art. I feel like she should be a New York folklore person, for sure.
Or New Jersey.
But I went over to her house.
Or New Jersey.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, she's like right over the bridge.
All right. We'll take her.
And so she taught me how to make a curry, a coconut chicken curry that her family ate for Shabbat dinner. And then she also taught me about this food ceremony called the Melida ceremony, which is not something that any other Jewish group in any part of the world does. It's basically like it's like Hindu meets Judaism. Hinduism meets Judaism because it's a offering to the prophet Elijah, where you take this plate of poha, which is like a flattened rice, and you decorate it with flowers and fruit, and it's perfumed with, I think, it has jaggery, the Indian kind of like brown sugar. It has fresh flowers, and they literally, like, anytime there's an auspicious occasion, a wedding, a bris, an engagement, someone buys a new home, someone graduates from college, you have this Melida ceremony as a way of sort of, offering thanks and also kind of like asking for auspicious times ahead. And that is literally not something you see in any other part of Jewish food or ritual tradition. And I just loved that, it's so important to that community. So anyways, those are just 3 examples of the types of research that I do, and how it's much more than just recipes, and it's about stories.
Absolutely. So I have a question. I know that you're so versed in the idiom. Do you create Jewish recipes that had theretofore not existed? Or are you always basing what you do on something that's out there already in the world?
I feel like with Jewish cuisine, everything is derivative of something. But I have played around a lot with, especially not with the Jewish cookbook. This was meant to be as sort of traditional as possible. But for example, in my little book of Jewish appetizers, I have a recipe for a borscht crostini. And it takes kind of the flavors of borscht, right? Like roasted beets and carrots and chopped dill with lemon zest and some like creme fraiche and pickled onions, and it puts it all on a crostini, or crostino, I guess. And so you get that vibe of a bowl of borscht, but it's in a completely different form. So that's more of what I do. I try to play around with flavors that are familiar with people.
Right. So of course, no cooking discussion is complete without a recipe. And we're going to talk a little bit about a recipe that you chose to share for these times, and kind of explain your thinking about choosing this recipe, Leah.
Yeah, so and I know we're going to make this recipe available on the Facebook page, or the New York Folklore Facebook page. So this is a recipe that comes from the Jewish cookbook, my recent one, and it is as it says, yeasted pumpkin bread. So it's a Sephardic bread. So it has pumpkin, which is a very kind of symbolic food for Sephardi Jews. I don't actually remember off the top of my head what the symbolism is, but I know it's an important ingredient. And it's in the shape of what, Eastern European Jews would think of for challah, for the ceremonial Friday night Shabbat bread. So I kind of loved how it pulled together kind of a Eastern European and a Sephardic vibe all into one loaf of bread. And it's so good. And it's like, you can make it with canned pumpkin. And so if you have yeast and you have flour, I know those things are hard to find right now, but if you have them, it's actually a very pantry friendly bread. And I know everyone's baking right now, so I thought it would be a fun one to share. And it's really good. It makes amazing French toast. If you have any left over, it freezes well. So if you don't think you can finish both loaves quickly, it's just a very comforting, sweet perfumed bread. I don't know if you go to the next page, I forgot what spices are in it. I think it's, so you go to the next, it has cardamom and ginger and cinnamon. So it's very just kind of warming sweet spices.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And we're so appreciative to have a recipe from you. I don't know that we really have time for many questions, and I'm not seeing any questions on the Zoom window. Do you see anything on Facebook there, Leah? If not, I always have plenty of questions.
I see people are watching, but I don't see any specific questions.
Okay, so I just have been actually enjoying learning about cooking so much during this time. I've been watching a lot of the Slow Food Live webinars. I mentioned to you that Poetry and Prose had Ruth Reichel on yesterday for a great webinar. And people ask questions like, and I'm going to ask you the same hackneyed questions that other people ask great cooks. If you were on a desert island and could only take 2 Jewish cookbooks with you, other than your own, which of course you know by heart, what would those cookbooks be?
Can I take 3?
Yes, you can take 3.
Okay. I would take the Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Roden. Claudia Roden is my absolute hero. She's an Egyptian Jew she grew up in Egypt. She lives in London now, and she wrote basically what to me was like the precursor for this book in the 90s. And the only reason I think we can write it again is because Jewish food has continued to evolve since then. Her book is perfect, but the food world has changed. So I would bring that. I would bring probably a book called Olive Trees and Honey by Gil Marks. He was an incredible food scholar who passed away probably 8 years ago, way too early. He was very young. But he was just one of those just encyclopedic brains of Jewish food. He actually wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Jewish Food. But his book, Olive Trees and Honey, is vegetarian recipes exclusively, and it just is like, it was way ahead of its time. And it's just the food is really beautiful, and his storytelling is great. And then I would definitely bring a book by Joan Nathan, who is sort of, in my mind, like the preeminent Jewish food historian / journalist of our time. So I probably would bring her book of Jewish American cooking. I forgot the name of it off the top of my head. Cooking in America, Jewish Cooking in America today. So those would be my 3.
And as a parent of young children, I want to ask you a little bit about what kind of cooking you do with them at home.
So I have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. My 5-year-old's almost 6, and he has not shown a terrible amount of interest in cooking, which I've really tried because I'm sort of trying to correct my own youth and probably have been overzealous about like, come into the kitchen with me. But I still kind of have to bribe him with chocolate chips to cook with me. But we will make challah sometimes. He likes the dough hook on our KitchenAid food processor. He will make hamantaschen with me. What else do we like to make? Actually, every fall we tend to go apple picking every fall. I think we haven't missed a year since he was born, and the last 2 years he's helped me to carefully chop the apples to then make applesauce, which we eat. It's my mom's recipe, so there's kind of like a 3 layers of generation going on there. So he will chop, and then we'll make a bunch of applesauce and eat part of it right away, and then save part of it in the freezer for Hanukkah, for latkes. So that's been kind of a nice ongoing tradition.
That's great. So I just want to show that we've taken the tagline of the New York Folklore Society and translated it into the several of the many languages that Jews speak around the world. We have Yiddish, we have Ladino, and we have Judeo-Arabic, which are all cuisines that you've touched on today. We have actually, I see that we do have 2 questions. I'm going to ask them very quickly. One comes from Valerie, who says, I'm hosting a Jewish event in the summer for a small group at a library. What do you suggest for easy foods to serve?
I would suggest serving some kind of, it's a funny name, not funny if you're from Iran, but unusual to us, a kuku, which is it's basically a Persian frittata. I have recipes for it in the Jewish cookbook, and you can get in touch with me after. I'm happy to send you the recipe. And it's basically like a Persian frittata with a bunch of herbs and some feta, and it's really great because you can serve it at room temperature, and you just bake it ahead and then cut it into small pieces when you get there and put it on trays, and it's very simple. So I would serve that.
Wonderful.
And then like obviously like, yeah, dips and stuff.
Sure. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step over you there. And then finally, the last question. Does any pithy Jewish food saying come to mind?
One of my favorite Yiddish food sayings, and I don't know it in Yiddish, but maybe Emily, you or Itzik would, is that worries go down better with soup than without. So the idea, if you have a bowl of soup, it makes your worries a little less worrisome.
Oh. But I'll have to check on that. That will be posted to the New York Folklore page. Okay, so I want to thank our exceptional cook and guest, Leah Koenig, and really hope that we can continue these wonderful flavors, this wonderful sharing, the celebration of community and diaspora. And thank you all so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Emily, it's been a pleasure, and I'm such a big fan of yours. So thank you so much for asking me to do this.
Oh, thank you, Leah. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.